to keep going back to that. And that's what I feel personally. I haven't lived that long, but in my lifetime, I've even seen the cycle multiple times, cycling. But we could talk about it after. So yeah, I believe capitalism is a good thing. It's a good, reasonable thing. I just believe that charity is something that society really needs to survive. Yeah, we'll start in a second. Yeah. That's another interesting question. Now, I believe personally, we'll talk about it a little bit today, but I believe when the founding fathers set up America, they also were relying that people would give charity. They were relying that people would give charity. Now, people in America, they give, in a certain sense, more charity than history, but relative to assets, way less than history. 100 years ago, nobody's ancestors had savings. No one had savings. Everyone, it wasn't a thing to save money. You just you didn't have it. You didn't have it. And you just, you'd make it through. Nowadays, people have a tremendous amount of assets, and relative to assets, I think charity. So I think we're living in an era now that we can make the change. And if we become kind people and we do things like tithing and things like that. Hey, if you don't believe me, by the way, you can watch Dave Ramsey. He says this stuff also. I just, now he's a religious guy, and he has his own story and his own belief. And you guys heard of Dave Ramsey? Yeah. So, he says this stuff also, he says this stuff also. It has a lot to do with society, because also, in addition to everything we're discussing, one of the problems with the economy and finances and capitalism is it does welcome greed. It does welcome greed. In other words, it doesn't negate greed. And greed, as we'll see soon in this lesson today, kind of is never ending. Greed is kind of never ending, and it can keep growing. So he's very into the fact that it's okay, you have all this money, what do you do with it? What's the purpose of it? And people who do not have purpose become greedy, because they're just what is the purpose? What do I do with this? That's why but anyways, we could talk about it more after. We're going to get started. There's a lot of interesting stuff which are actually related to this, which are very interesting. All right, so welcome. It's always bittersweet when it's the last lesson of JLI. It's nice to see everybody. Well, luckily, there's a lot of other stuff that goes on here. There's First Fridays this week, Saturday morning services every Saturday. And of course, we're going to jump into the high holidays. This year, there's actually 3 amazing courses. I didn't read them, but the pilot Chabads that gave them said they were really amazing, and we'll announce them at the end. We're going to offer a bundle probably in the next month if you want to sign up to all 3 classes for cheaper. It's literally so I'm happy to give the discount if I can get more people. Right. So if I can get people to sign up for bundles in the beginning, then I'll have more capital to, and then exactly. And then once we build up JLI, we can give more discounts. Right. We can give more. And that's the goal. Right. If we have more income, we can give more. Chabad works like that. Right. If there's more cash flow, then there's more income. We're also going to be launching a women's JLI program. It's 7 Rosh Chodeshes, 7 beginning of each month. My wife's going to give it. It's going to be a really fabulous year. Yes, actually, JLI, when it comes to Chabad, is very capitalistic, and they created it that way, and it grows beyond leaps and bounds. At the same time that JLI is very capitalistic, I have been able to include more people who can't afford tuition than ever before, right? I've been able to include more people than ever before because I can afford to, frankly. So I want to say thank you to everybody for joining. We're going to jump into this class, and we're going to talk about separation of powers. Now, some people know what that is. Some people don't know what it is, but they heard about it in high school. Everyone remembers separations of powers in high school, and many of us probably remember it being the most boring days of our life, right? In social studies. But actually today is going to be really interesting. So if you missed it in high school, you get it today. Yeah, you have a question before we?
No, it was first grade did a piece fully on Sunday about the founding fathers.
Oh, interesting.
I
Chaim Solomon. So Chaim Solomon is actually from the Jewish side. He funded a lot of the Revolutionary War. From the anti-Semitic side, that means America. He never got paid back, so that means America kind of belongs to the Jews, right? But yeah, all right. No, that's very interesting. I came across a really interesting book by a guy named Eric Nelson, and he argues. We didn't go so much into this course, but we live and we sit in life, but there's always like revolutionary ideas that keep switching. And one of the big revolutionary changes in the 17th century was the era of Hebraists, who were primarily not Jewish, but they were fascinated with the Talmud and the Jewish tradition. And a lot of America and a lot of Western civilization actually, and there are even ideas like today we'll introduce separation of powers, doesn't seem directly related to Judaism. But he argues a lot of them, even though the authors weren't necessarily even fond of Judaism. We didn't talk about anti-Semitism in America in this course, but a lot of the ideas, the way they infiltrate into society, not always do you track them down. So this is an interesting book that I saw, Eric Nelson. I can't remember what the book is called. It's called like the Hebraist Society or something like that. Anyways, so we're going to jump into this history of separation of powers, and we're going to get. So we're going to go we have some of the text here. This is the U.S. Constitution, text one. We're not going to read it today. We just basically watched in the video about it. Also, we have Montesquieu's Preventing Tyranny. That's where it talks about this idea. So the general idea is you have three branches, right? Three branches. and they all have checks and balances with each other. They're all kind of meddled with each other. And that way they can check and no one's going to get too much power. Montesquieu argued it was his own life experience and a lot of history that absolute power leads to tyranny. Absolute power leads to tyranny. And therefore, he came up with this system. And the idea of the system is there were different categories, as we'll see soon, we'll go more into it, that ran the country, and they were able to help each other. So now we're going to get into the Jewish side. Now, the truth is, in Montesquieu's book, unlike the last few weeks, he doesn't say like, hey, this is really great, this is in the Bible, or whatever it is. He's totally talking from experience, from his recent history of monarchs in Europe and all around the world. However, there's a lot in common with Judaism and the Torah, and some would even argue that pre him, these ideas existed in the world. We find in the Bible and in the Jewish kingdom in Israel, you had the Jewish king, that was the executive power, and he was able to rule the country executively. And then you had the judicial power, which were the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin were the authority to interpret the law. They were 71 rabbis, and their location was at the temple in Jerusalem. So if anyone here been to the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, right? So if you go to Israel, on top of that platform was the temple in Jerusalem. It's deeply debated exactly where. And then on top of that platform was the temple in Jerusalem, and in there was a big room, and that's where the judges, they were called the Sanhedrin. There were 71 judges. Now we're going to jump right into the Torah, and we are going to see where the Torah indicates you need this type of separation of powers. If you can read text 3 on page 89. Okay, so this is a big section of scripture from the Bible, from Deuteronomy. So let's just go through quickly. So number one, we talk about the judicial system. Now, the judicial system, the way it worked was, in Judaism, we follow the Torah, right? We follow the Bible. Now, we follow the oral interpretation, which was passed down from the times of Moses. So Moses brought the Torah, and then he interpreted it, explained everything. And then that was passed down, and that part, the oral Torah, is what we make relevant to life. Now, how did we do that for many years? We had what was called, the Torah says, the Sanhedrin. Their location was in the Holy Temple, and there were 71 chosen rabbis. 71 chosen rabbis. We also mentioned there were the Kohanim and the Levite tribe. The Levite tribe were people who didn't work. They were spiritual people. God wanted them dedicated to spirituality, and the Kohanim as well. And that's why they were actually supported by the public, right? They were supported by the public. Now, God did all this so this could create a spiritual system to guide the Jewish people. Then we talk about the king. We talk about having a king, and we talk about how he can't get married to too many wives, he can't have too many horses, and the Torah specifies the laws about the king, which we'll get to soon. Now, one could ask, why is the king separate from the judicial system? We see the king is totally separate from the judicial system, right? The first verses talk about the rabbis and the Levites who are running the law, and then only afterwards it talks about the king. So why is there no kings in the judicial system? So we'll jump right to Maimonides, who was the codifier of Jewish law, on text 4. Well, kings have executive power. There were many kings who were tremendous Torah scholars. One of the famous ones was King David. King David was a tremendous scholar, and he could give legal rulings better than anybody else. King David was a really, really tremendous scholar. But he was not allowed to sit on the Sanhedrin for a very simple reason. The Torah gives kings executive ruling powers. So you would not be able to disagree with him in public. So we have 71 rabbis. The law is going to follow the majority rule of these 71 rabbis. And if you have a king there, it's kind of going to mess things up. Everyone will need to follow him, and then it's going to mess things up. Furthermore, another reason why is because in Judaism, kings are not above the law. They're not above the law. And therefore, we don't want to give him any judicial power because the law may need to judge him, right? He's not above the law. Now, we don't necessarily think the system of kings in Judaism is necessary for the whole world. A republic is okay according to Judaism. This was specifically in what God wanted the Jews to live sovereignly in Israel. This is how he wants us to do it with this type of king. Now, I want to note also that the king he's above certain laws. The Torah does give him certain freedoms that the regular citizens don't have. He does have executive power. He's listened to. Everyone's got to listen to him, etc., etc. And he does have certain things that other people are not allowed to do, and there's certain loopholes and leniencies with the king. However, those are also rooted in the law, which is in the Torah run by Sanhedrin. So he never has a free-for-all opportunity. He can't say, I'm going to change the law or change this. He can only do what God decided for him in the Torah, right? So that's how kings work. Now, the goal of separating the judicial system and the executive, the king, is in order that the king should know he's also under the Torah. He's also under God's law. And this is, we read in text 5. We're going to read text 5 on page 92. So, in fact, if a king does something wrong, witnesses can come and they could say, hey, he broke the law. You can end up in prison or end up fined. We find a lot of interesting stories actually with kings. We gave a course, our first JLI course here was actually about personalities in the Bible. And one of the personalities we went through was King David. And we quoted the Talmud that said King David never sinned, even with Bathsheba. And it was a fascinating discussion of scriptures. But the point is he ended up, he didn't really break the law. And that's what bothered him, actually, because if you break the law, then you can serve your time. You do your crime, you do your time, and you're done. And the prophet at that time said, you didn't break the law, and therefore, but you did something that wasn't great, but you didn't break the law, and that's why you got to kind of figure it out yourself. And King David, that's why he was sad his whole life, because you know, if you do the crime, you can do the time, and then you're done. King David couldn't do that. Anyways, furthermore, kings, actually, we read in the Torah that kings have several other ideas which they need to do. So number one, kings, we said that kings have to have their own Torah scroll. Now, did anyone here ever write a Torah before? So the way you write a Torah, I'll tell you what it is. The Torah says every Jew is supposed to write the whole Torah. Now the problem is first of all, only Jewish males who have the tradition, are especially trained and passed down, are able to write Torahs. So that excludes a lot of us. I don't know how to write a Torah. So what do you do to write a Torah? What you do to write a Torah is, the tradition is you only have to write one letter. Because if the Torah is missing one letter, the whole Torah is not kosher. Right? The whole Torah is not kosher. So if you do one letter, you made it kosher. Right? You made the whole Torah. Now, also, you don't have to write it. You can pay someone to write it. You can say, you write it for me. A couple years ago, we actually wrote a Torah here in Prescott. We had a whole celebration. And many people joined together and they sponsored a letter or a word or a verse. That way they could have the mitzvah of writing the Torah. In the 70s, the Lubavitch Rebbe started a campaign of every child having a letter in the Torah. Every child having a letter in the Torah. And it was $1. Until today, every child, they can go send $1 to Israel, and they get a letter, they get a certificate where their letter in the Torah is. They have since, just 2 days ago, they finished the 9th Torah. So each Torah has 314,000 letters. So that's like probably 4 million kids who have letters in the Torah. You can go online to chabad.org and pay, it's like $5 and get a letter in a Torah. They have like a Torah that they use. You know, it's they have a Torah that they keep writing, and it's a really, really special mitzvah. So every Jew can do that. It's really easy. You write a letter in the Torah. We did it here, one of our Torahs. We finished here. Everyone contributed to it. We got the whole Torah done. Some people contributed tens of thousands of dollars. Some people contributed $18. We made sure that we were able to get the Torah done. Now, a king has another mitzvah. He has to write an additional Torah. Right? So he's like every Jew, who's got to be part of a Torah writing, but he has to write an additional Torah, which he keeps with him always. Now, why does he do that? It's in order to remind the king that God, he has to follow the laws of God. He is not the top of the world. He is under God. He's a king under God, meant to represent God, represent God's laws, and therefore he has to keep this Torah with him always. He's also subject to court authority, and we said also, he's limited how many wives he can marry. Now, how many wives can a king marry? Anyone know? How many wives can a king marry? Anyone know in the Bible? How many wives can a regular person marry? Anyone know? So in the Bible, a man, if he could afford it, was able to marry up to 4 wives. 4 wives. That way, every month, they each get like a week of relationship, right? They get a week of relationship, right? So, but a king could marry up to 18 wives, no more. Now, why do we say 1? So when Jews went and they left the Middle East in, the 7th, 8th century, 9th, 10th century, there was a rabbi named Rabbi Gershon Moragola. This is off the record. I just want to share it. It's very interesting. And he made a rule that from now on, Jews are allowed to marry only 1 wife. Male Jews can only marry 1 wife. And he said this rule is enacted for 1,000 years. It actually ended relatively recently. But the rabbis in Jewish law, they said, we're going to continue this. Sephardim were not under this rule, but they basically took it upon themselves in the 1500s. Now, why did he make that rule? Well, we can't really imagine what it's like to marry multiple wives, but obviously marriages and families were different. There were several reasons why. When they went to Germany, Jews were exiled and they ended up in Germany. The civil law in Germany was only 1 wife. And he didn't want Jews to mess with the civil law so much. But mainly, he said that, in Israel, the communities were very intact. So if you had a dysfunctional family, your kids would kind of be taken in the city. There were other families. Everyone lived together. You were part of this community. However, in exile in Germany, there was no more strong Jewish communities. So if your kids, you had a dysfunctional family with multiple wives, they would just assimilate. They wouldn't be picked up by the community. There wasn't a sense of community. Furthermore, in Israel, people knew you. They knew if you were behaving or not in these small communities. If a guy had 2 wives or 4 wives, He married them. He paid for them. According to Jewish law, a husband has to support his wife. There was no monkey business. However, in Germany, people would start cheating on their wives and say, "Oh, I'm actually married to her," and that would cause more dysfunction. There were several reasons, and that's why he enacted it. Now, kings were allowed to marry more than a regular person because they could afford to. Their schedule and their time was a little easier. We all know that King Solomon married how many wives? Anyone know? 1,000. 1,000. Now, the Talmud says King Solomon, he got punished by God for marrying so many wives because the Torah says a king can't marry so many wives. But he actually, interestingly enough, in the Talmud it says that King Solomon reasoned that there were many, poor people and homeless people. If he would just marry many women, even if he didn't live with them or know them, they would automatically be supported by his kingdom. So he looked at a way of helping women who didn't want to get married, essentially with welfare. Furthermore, in his time, there was peace in the world, and there were many converts. Many people wanted to convert to Judaism until they finally had to say no more converts because Judaism was doing so well then. People wanted to convert, and they knew that Judaism was going to get hard again. So he married into many different kingdoms, and it kind of made world peace. However, nevertheless, he was punished. Now, how many horses is a king allowed to have? Well, he's allowed to have one for himself. He's allowed to have as many as he needs. But he's not allowed to have horses just for sport. And how much gold is a king allowed to have? Well, for the country, they can have unlimited. Wouldn't it be nice if the dollar was backed by gold, right? But for himself, he wasn't allowed to have too much gold. Now, why not? What is the reason? So we're going to read an excerpt in text 6. This is from Rav Saadia Gaon. Rav Saadia Gaon is a very, very important person in Jewish history. He comes from the era of Gaonim, which is from the 9th century. Now, anyone heard of Rav Saadia Gaon before? So I'm going to tell you, it's really, really interesting. Rav Saadia Gaon, so Jews were in the Middle East, they were in Israel, and then eventually they were kicked into Babylonia. This is, and then life was really tough over there. There were all sorts of sheiks and pashas in Turkey and Islamic countries and the Crusades, all abusing the Jews. Anyways, in his era, what was happening is this is a common thing that happens to Jews. They end up in another country, and people say, hey, our religions are not so different. Our religions are not so different. And that's how Jews start to assimilate. They start seeing similar values in other religions, and they don't realize that Judaism has very, very specific values. And, if you start finding commonalities, you'll lose what Judaism has. This was happening in his era in the Islamic communities in Babylonia. Jews were realizing that there was so much in common with the belief system then that, they started associating their beliefs with the other religions. Rav Saadia Gaon was a rabbi. He was one of the chief rabbis then, and he wrote a book called Emunas Fideus. And what was significant about it was one of the first books of Jewish philosophy. And the point of his book is to explain the unique philosophies of the Jewish people in order that they would maintain. Now, until then, it was obvious because Jews never were living amongst other nations. So Jews just knew it. But once they started living amongst other nations, they started saying, hey, this isn't so bad. As long as you keep a religion, that's good. As long as you believe in God, that's good. When in fact, the Torah has very specific commandments. And that's how his book came out. Interestingly enough, the same thing happened in America in the early 1900s. And it kind of had to go through correction. So we're going to read from Saadia Gaon. He explains, why is it, so text 6, why is it that we have all these restrictions on being king? I mean, if you're king, you should get to marry as many wives as you want, right? Why do we have so many restrictions? So where are we holding? Who are we holding by? All right, so text 6.
It is a
So this is unchecked ego power inflates the ego. This we see very commonly nowadays. Actually, capitalism is a really good example. Nowadays, we watch videos on social media all the time of people who are successful financially and they're giving advice about everything. Everything. Now, we don't even know them. We don't even know how successfully financially they are. We don't know if that has anything to do with the rest of their life. But that's the way people are. When we get power, we start giving our opinions about things. Next thing you know, I mean, nowadays we have, you guys know what influencers are? So influencers are everywhere. They're giving advice about everything. Some of them are giving advice about medicine, but they're not doctors. They're not doctors. We're giving advice about medicine, and we look at them and we say, hey, well, they're successful, right? They're successful. They must be something to it. Well, might not be anything to it, right? So the Torah recognizes this, and the Torah says if we give the king unchecked powers, his ego is going to grow until finally he says, you know, God was really good at working the economy out back in Israel 2,000 years ago, but nowadays we got to switch up God's ideas of economy, or God's idea of gods, or God's idea of anything. And this is what the Torah recognized. When we give a king executive power, it's going to get to his head. And therefore, he had the Torah scroll, he had the laws, he wasn't part of the judicial system, so they could balance him, and they could check him and say, hey, you're not being a king the way God wants. And therefore, you know, you're not going to be king anymore. Now, this is the oversight of kings in Jewish law, and we've looked at it within Torah law. So now one thing we didn't talk about is in Torah law is different than American law. The Torah law is very different for a very simple reason. In the Torah law, we don't have a legislative branch. What is the legislative branch in Torah law? It's the Torah, right? In America, we have a legislative branch. We make laws. We make the best laws. But in the Torah law, we follow the Torah. This is what Isaiah says. We'll read Isaiah on text 95. So page 95, text 7, sorry. So here Isaiah says something really, really important. The Lord is our judicial system. The Lord is our legislative system. And the Lord is actually our king. Now, these are the three branches of government. We have the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. But in Torah, we believe that all of them are really God. All of them are really God. Now, in America, we have the Constitution and we have the legislative branch. But in the Torah, everything ultimately goes down to God. And this is why the Torah vision of government is actually quite different than America. Because when all the Jews are living in Israel, we believe that everything is divine origin. Ultimately, if we're putting the king that God wants, and we have judges that God wants, and we're following his laws, then ultimately everyone is following God. On the other hand, besides Israel, the origin of laws is actually secular. It's for the people, by the people. They're not divine, right? They're not divine. They're created for people in order to run a good system, which they're trying to run the best system possible. Now, in the olden times, the way it worked is you had God give the laws in the Torah. You had all these rabbis studying the Torah. They become the judges. And then you have the king who makes the laws, who makes sure that, you know, the police are working, the laws are happening, people are following. That's how it worked. Now, ultimately, it came back to God. Now, in the Torah system, though, there were still checks and balances, right? There's still checks and balances. Who would be the best checks and balances for the Torah system? Well, the best would be God himself, right? He could say, hey, you're not following my laws, right? So actually in the Torah we have that. We'll read text 8. Text 8, and read it in the back. All right. So number one, you had the Levites. The Levites were a tribe which God wanted them dedicated to spiritual needs, spiritual needs. So they were encouraged not to work to make money, but in fact, they should be invested in teaching, serving the community. And that way, people, first of all, would always be connected to the spiritual beliefs. This is actually somewhat similar, believe it or not, to Chabad rabbis. Chabad rabbis are meant to be supported by the community. Now, historically, actually, when Chabad rabbis first went to San Francisco, it's difficult. You know, not a lot of people give a lot of charity in America. And the rabbis were having a hard time. There's a rabbi in San Francisco. So there was someone there who said, I'm a big businessman. How about I'll make Chabad work for my franchise? They meet a lot of people, and they'll be businessmen. They'll make money, from business, and that will support Chabad. And he wrote to the Rebbe, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe gave 7 reasons. He said absolutely not, for several reasons. One of the reasons he said if they do that, people will not be invested in spirituality. He said, I want people to know that the rabbis are totally trying to do Judaism and living spiritually 100%, and people will invest in that. And that way that will connect them to that, similar to the Levites in the Bible. The Levites were the same way. So number one, you had the Levites. In the whole system of ancient Israel, you had the Levites who were there to remind people, we're living for spirituality, to remind people that really life is not about survival of the fittest. It's really about God. And that was the job of the Levites. So that was the first balancing act. The first check was the Levites, and they were supported by the people. Now we're going to get to the second one. Now, what's interesting is, so Levites, which include the Kohanim, some people here, I know your dad's probably a Kohen. The Kohanim, they were public servants. They were dedicated to the spiritual worlds. There were certain kings throughout Jewish history, and they tried to get the executive branch to connect to the Levites. And what do you think it did? This was a King Yanai in the Tanakh. What do you think it did? It led to tremendous corruption, because the Levites are there because they are supported financially by everybody else. They don't have to think about which laws work economically. They're totally living altruistically. And they're able to say, hey, it doesn't matter if that makes money, that's wrong, right? Now, Yanai was a king, and he tried to become the high priest. Now, if you have the high priest also has foot in the game economically, then he's not going to be able to share altruistic values, right? And it leads to corruption. So that was the first rule. You had the Levites, and they were a tribe which was dedicated to spiritual form of life, dedicated to spirituality, living altruistically. We have a similar system in America to a certain extent. It's called non-profits, not-for-profits. What are not-for-profits? They're essentially owned by the American government to help in better society. They're helped in better society, and people donate to them, and they say, hey, I'm going to invest in this nonprofit in order to make society better. Now, talking about profits, the second thing God had, and we have in the Torah, is profits. Profits, right? No pun intended. Profits. Now, what are profits? Let's look in Deuteronomy, and we'll read Deuteronomy text 9 on page 96. Were we holding? I think we're holding. Yes. All right. So God sent prophets. Now, prophets were people, and you can read them in the books of prophets. God communicated with them. Now, once they established, according to Jewish law, that God communicated to them, you had to listen to them. If you would listen to them, you would be penalized, sometimes even death penalty, going against the prophet. Now, prophets would come to people individually and say, hey, you better fix this in your life, otherwise this is going to happen. Or they would come to the king. They would come globally. God would communicate to them. Now, this is how God influenced the government. This is how God would influence the government and the executive powers. And this is how essentially God did the legislative branch, and then he would influence it and check on it with prophets and the Kohanim and the Levites. Any questions so far before we jump into America? All right, yes. That's an excellent question. I'm going to just share briefly. It's a really, really interesting, very, very interesting point. So in the Torah, it's actually in this week's portion, it talks about how to identify a prophet. And it says exactly how to do it. Now, Maimonides says something really, really fascinating. Prophets would typically identify themselves by predicting something in the future. And there's a certain system how to verify if what he's saying is true, and then he becomes a prophet, and then you have to listen to him. So Maimonides says, if you read in the future, and then they would predict something, say, like in the future, and then they would say, okay, this is the law God wants you to keep. They would say a mission from God. The Torah says, what if a prophet predicts something, and then he says something that goes against the Torah? Do you believe him? So Maimonides says something really interesting. He says, we don't believe prophets because they do cool tricks. We don't do it because they do cool tricks. The Torah says, only if he says something supportive of the Torah, you believe him. If he says something that's not supportive of the Torah, you don't believe him. So why would God send a guy who does cool tricks and he says something not supportive? Well, the Torah says, God wants to see how careful you are in following him. He's testing you. He's testing you. So that's the way generally prophets work. Now, ultimately, Maimonides says, why do we believe prophets? Not because they show that they're prophets. We believe them because Moses in the Torah said in God's name how to recognize them and how to believe them. So really, we're just following Moses who's following God. If someone comes nowadays and says, hey, your car is going to fly tomorrow, and it flies, and then he says, okay, go eat some bacon, you're not allowed to listen to him. He's not a real prophet. That's what the Torah says. He did a cool trick. Maybe he does black magic or something like that, but he's not a prophet. So prophets were actually God's way of making sure that the law continued to be kept. Now, we read in the Torah, it wasn't that God's concern wasn't, that he was worried that, that there would be too much tyranny. But that also helped out. There were times that power brought to tyranny, absolute power brought to tyranny. But generally, God was just trying to check to make sure that the Sanhedrin and the kings, everyone is still following his law. And that's how the Torah works. So here we have this graphic over here. Divine will, we got the Torah, and then he will not turn from the commandment, and that's how the executive powers worked. All right, now let's talk about America a little bit. Now, the Jewish law version of government is called theocracy, right? We have a religion. Everyone shares the same religion, and therefore the government enforces the religion, the king enforces the religion, and everyone is following God. However, that's not what happened in America. In America, the founding fathers were actually escaping religious tyranny, and they said, let's come to a new country where our values are not that we share the same religion, and therefore we're not going to enforce a religion in the government. And this is where the First Amendment came in. Establishment of official state religion. The First Amendment, and we'll read it first, and then we'll read from text 10, from the First Amendment.
Shall make no religion.
All right, so we got 2 points over here. Number one, it prohibits Congress from establishing an official state religion. And that's called the Establishment Clause, right? Establishment of official state religion is not allowed. And point B was it prohibits Congress from interfering in people's freedom to practice their religion. And that's the Free Exercise Clause. Now, it seems quite narrow. It seems like a wonderful thing, right? So here we have the founding fathers. They're saying we're creating a country where not everybody has a common religion. I was talking about it last night. If you want to sum up Israeli politics in one sentence, Israeli politics is a debate. Is Israel a country of Jews, or is it a Jewish country? The people who are religious say it's a Jewish country. Hey, we're a bunch of Jews. We're Jewish. Let's keep Judaism. We're a Jewish country. And the people who are not religious say, no, this is a democratic republic, and happens to be there's a lot of Jews here. So is Israel a Jewish country, or is it a country of Jews? This is pretty much split 50-50 in the Israeli parliament and the Knesset, and this is pretty much where every debate in Israel comes from. Not joking. This is where every debate comes from. Who's going to win? I don't know. We'll see. But that is the debate. In America, they didn't have that issue. The founding fathers understood that we are not a religious country. We are a country that perhaps has a lot of religions. Maybe it could have a lot of religious people, but we're not a religious country. Now, so this seems really good. The government cannot interfere with your religion. You can have whatever religion you want. And also the government cannot establish a state religion. Now, originally, when the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, they didn't enforce it in every state. It wasn't, and states had the option to work with it as much as they wanted. It wasn't fully operating everywhere. So actually in Connecticut, there was, Connecticut actually had a state religion. They followed the Congregational Church. And there was a group from the Danbury Baptist Association who reached out to Thomas Jefferson. They don't have religious freedom. So Thomas Jefferson wrote to them, and he talked about a concept called the Wall of Separation. Now, the Wall of Separation has been in the Supreme Court many, many times. Now, what happened with the Wall of Separation was it essentially created that government cannot support anything religious, and actually God cannot be mentioned in anything which is state-run or government-run. Now, this is actually the current interpretation. Now, this is, many legal scholars maintain that this is actually a grave mistake. This is a grave mistake. Because the founding fathers they didn't want separation of religion from the government, number one, to limit religion. They wanted to protect religion. They actually wanted to protect religion, give people the freedom to practice whatever religion they want. But furthermore, what it did is it caused the dropping of a lot of American values. And we're going to read now from the Lubavitcher Rebbe to understand this. This is something that the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually spoke about a lot, and I'll tell you different contexts of it. I'm going to read next text.
Yeah. One of the fundamental principles that a child must learn in order to grow up to be a human being is that God exists, that the world has a master that supervises its functioning. A child must know that the world has a master set of principles. In this manner, stable. There are no taking such state. But places fundamental elements to each the government.
All right, so after this course, we learned a lot of ideals in America originate in the Bible. They originate in the Bible. Now, here's what the Rebbe was talking about in particular. He was talking about school prayer. Now, as a New Yorker, the Lubavitch Rebbe was in New York. When they took prayer out of the schools, crime rates went way up. And that was track data. Crime rates went way up. Now, what the Rebbe pointed out was the Constitution, whether you like it or not, whatever religion you are, you have to understand the context of it. The context of it is in the mind of the founding fathers, belief in God was a basic. It was unquestionable. Everyone then believed in God. And the values of the Constitution were all based on that belief in God. Equality, rights, liberty, they're all based on belief in God. Now, the separation of church and state was not to take the belief in God away from people, which it did, right? On the contrary, it was to protect their rights to believe in whatever religion they want further than the Constitution, more than the Constitution. So whether we like it or not, the founders did not want to banish God. They were actually following the way they understood what God wants. Taking away God, actually, by taking away the prayer, it actually ends up weakening the values of the Constitution. If you don't have a God, then you don't have equal rights eventually. If you don't have a God, you don't have a basis for morality. You don't have a basis for morality. So the Rebbe said this is quite a predicament. If the separation in church and state means making a wall and taking out God from everything, what's going to happen is it's actually going to weaken the American values, because the American values are based on God. And that's clear from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. So the Rebbe felt strongly. He said, well, this is quite a predicament. We can't enforce religion in America. We can't enforce religion in America. But if we don't have the belief in God, then we don't have America, right? We don't have the values of America. So what do? So actually, initially the Rebbe said, well, we've got to bring some non-denominational prayer into schools. But it was not passed in the Supreme Court. So that's where the Rebbe, and some of you remember this, he introduced the idea of the moment of silence. We had this in last course. What was the moment of silence? So if you take a belief in God, all the values fall. What was the idea of moment of silence? So starting 1983, the Rebbe was trying to advocate for a non-denominational prayer. He just simply said that if kids are not educated with God, and the country is not educated with God, then the country's values will fall apart. Just a matter of time. So the Rebbe advocated for a moment of silence. What was a moment of silence? It was every school child should come in the beginning of the day, and there should be like 30 seconds, or there's official law. It's like actually enacted in Arizona and many different states. They should meditate for the first minute of school, and their teacher's not allowed to tell them what to meditate on, and they should meditate on whatever they want. Whatever they want. And the Rebbe said there should be no reason to be against this. If they waste their time and think about baseball, it's not the end of the world. But many kids are going to go to their parents and they're going to say, what do I think about during the moment of silence? And their parents are going to say, they might say, oh, well, you're Jewish. You think about the Torah. Or you're Christian, or you're Muslim. You think about our higher power, our core of morality. The Rebbe even said some people, their parents are going to say, I don't know. Maybe ask my parents, ask your grandparents. And that would bring back some belief in a higher power which would support the values of the founding fathers once again. The Rebbe spoke about it would speak every Shabbat, but he spoke about many weeks. He said this would bring parents together with the children, not just talking about regular things, sports, and whatever they want to talk about, different subjects, but they'll actually have meaningful conversations about what they believe in, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. If you don't have a God, we spoke about this last course, you don't really have a right and wrong. The Rebbe decried a lot how in schools they teach subjects, but subjects are just means to get what you want. If you're good at math, good at business, well, that doesn't mean you're a good person. That means you can amass money to use for whatever you want, might be for terrible things. So this was the idea of a moment of silence, and the Rebbe felt this would be a core in bringing back what the founding fathers wanted. It would bring focus, character, values, and growth. So we'll continue, and we'll see how the Rebbe elaborated in the idea of moments of silence in text 12. question? So I'll tell you the history. So I just want to note what the Rebbe noted. The Rebbe really viewed society as a society which is America is a country which is meant to bring us all closer to fulfilling our purpose from God. And he said the founding fathers understood that. But the only way to bring it about is by mentioning God. But there's a lot of difficulty with that. So the Rebbe viewed that if we have the moment of silence for kids, they'll bring up the conversations with their families. It'll bring the whole idea home. Parents will start introducing it more to their families, and this would actually change over society. Now, the moment of silence, the Rebbe introduced it. Originally, he was trying to propose non-denominational prayers. It was very, very difficult. And then in 1983, the Rebbe came up with this idea, and he said, okay, this is going to be the idea that saves America. Now, in Arizona, I think it was, are you in a public school? So in America, in Arizona, because of the STOs, not a lot of kids go to public school, in Arizona as other states, because they have the private and charter schools. But actually, they made it law about 4 years ago. They made it law 4 years ago in Arizona that every public school has to do the moment of silence. And, it's interesting because I was somewhat involved. I had spoken to the local superintendent, and he told me, he said, private schools do whatever they want. Public schools, he said, I can't say anything. I need the government to say it. You should know that in the votings in Phoenix, there were people who were against it. And they said, what are kids going to waste their time? It's going to take too long. Moment of silence is always just long enough that it gets awkward. That's the key. Because once it gets awkward, then people start searching. They start trying to figure out what they're supposed to do, what religion they are. I actually saw the hearings. People said, someone said, the kids are just going to waste their time and think about whatever movie they want. And some of the other governors said, well, what's the problem with that? Is that so bad? Yeah. Well, so how long is it in Arizona? It's like a minute long?
Maybe. I mean, sometimes it's awkward because.
Yeah. Well, this is where it comes from. And, this obviously brings the question to all of us. When we hear about the moment of silence, as American Jews, do we bring God into our home enough? We can grow spiritually. And when we do that and we bring God into our lives, it actually helps the country. People were asking me last night about separation church and state. So one of the other big battles the Rebbe did with separation church and state was the public menorah. Now, in every city where there's Chabad, they light the menorah in city space. We light it here on the square. We also light in Prescott Valley, also in Chino Valley. Many places, they leave it there the whole week. And when it started in the 70s, the first public menorah was in Union Square and was sponsored by Bill Graham. Anyone heard of Bill Graham? All right, well, he sponsored the first menorah. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he was the producer of the Grateful Dead. So he sponsored the first menorah. It's still there on Union Square, the same one today. And people fought against it vehemently. Who fought against it? Of course, non-religious Jews. So you can't put the menorah there. Well, why not? It's a separation between church and state. How could it be on city property? Anyways, after the menorah in Ohio went all the way to the Supreme Court, the lawyer is a famous Orthodox Jew. His name is Nathan Lewin. He's still alive today. He's probably in his 90s. His daughter now still kind of fights his cases. He fought a lot of religious battles in the Supreme Court. And the point and this is what the Rebbe kind of initiated the battle. He said, it's not illegal to put a religious item on state property. It's religious for the government to mandate a religious item in people's houses, to mandate a religion, but not to acknowledge that the religions live in our country. They're not endorsing the religion, they're just acknowledging that there's Jewish people here, they celebrate Hanukkah, and we're happy to have that. Our first menorah, we put in the square here, and the next day there was an article in the Courier, and there were the comment sections. I never respond to comments. Nowadays, thank God, I got a lot of anti-Semitic ones, but back in the day, we didn't. So someone said, you can't do that. Once there's a menorah, every religion is going to come out and put their item, and then satanic people are going to come and put their item, and look what you're going to create. So someone commented, and they said, well, legally, they're allowed to do that. In the United States, you're allowed to do that. Now, I mentioned yesterday, this is a misunderstanding a lot of people have. The Founding Fathers were not against religion. in order to create the country, there were certain values which they said these values are common values that we're going to base our country on. So if somebody has a religion that goes against those values, well, then they can't really live in America. If you have a religion that says to hurt someone else, let's say, well, you can't really live in America because America's values go against that. The religious values of the founding fathers go against that. You can find another country that allows that. That's what you can do. So as long as you're putting an item on city property or state property and it is not violating someone else's values, then it's okay. And that's allowed in America. This obviously gave the ability for people to celebrate religion. There are some states that when they put a public menorah, there's some states that even sponsor it, and they'll sponsor different religions things. Most states say, no, we can't sponsor it because, we don't endorse a religion. They'll even put a sign, we welcome the Jewish community of wherever it is, but we don't endorse the religion. Like we endorse the religion, but we're not trying to proselytize anyone to this religion. But this is how the separation of church and state works. And this is where, on one hand, it gets tricky, but on the other hand, we are able to live in a country, under God. You don't have to believe in God in this country. You don't have to believe in it. But you have to be aware that you're living in a country that's values are based on God. And you have to be respectable to that. If you can't be respectable to that, then you have to find another country. If you can't find another one, then, they might open up Mars or different other planets. All right, well, this is the end of our course. We're going to sum up now the last 4 weeks. It's been really, really interesting. This course should be a really good source of Jewish pride. We see why Jews are able to be so comfortable in America and why we're able to be unapologetic Judaism. We're able to be proud Jews. The first lesson, we talked about the Pilgrim's worldview and how it was shaped from biblical beliefs. We talked about the covenantal, America's foundations were laid in a covenant, which are continual investments. So this is actually an exercise at the end, which you could fill out in your own time. If you'd like, you could fill out now. But the course says, how can I integrate these Jewish principles of living, continually supporting a covenant, and being unapologetically Jewish? How can I grow in that? Lesson 2, we talked about how all men are created equal and how that's actually a biblical value. And it's a radical Jewish innovation. You may remember the chart of metals from Plato. And being created in God's image is supposed to give us a lot of responsibility. So how can we take on more responsibility as Jews? Number 3, we talked about the American dream, how it's inspired by the Jubilee system. We also talked about how everything in America, all finances say, in God we trust. It was really interesting yesterday. Somebody gifted someone else here a 2-cent piece from 1864. Because of this course, they wanted to give him one that says, in God we trust. I didn't look into it, but it didn't say in God we trust on it. But it could be that, it was rubbed out. It was a pretty old coin that they bought on eBay. So how can we grow in that, in our trust in God? And then finally, the Torah has its own separation between the different branches, but its focus is on maintaining loyalty to God and keeping God in the forefront. And that is finally another lesson we can do. That is the end of this 4-week lesson. We won't be here next week. So just once in a while, somebody comes the next week, after 7 courses. And this one's a little different because most of them are 6 weeks, and this one's only 4, and each one was an hour long, which is quite a bit shorter. It's usually an hour and a half. I don't know what the courses are going to be next year. I know what the titles. I'll introduce them in a second. So our lineup for next year, we'll email it out probably in the next month as more stuff comes out about it. Then we have the Kabbalah and the Hidden Architecture of You. So this, they said, is very different than any Kabbalah course we gave. It's going to talk about reincarnation, soulmates, pets, names, and a lot of interesting practical, not practical Kabbalah. Last week we gave a course on kind of practical Kabbalah. This is going to be more about why things in your life are certain ways, according to Kabbalah, why you like certain colors and things like that. I have not seen the course yet, but they said it's a really, the people who piloted said it's really unique. The next one is going to be the missing piece, the foundation behind Israel's, so there's fall is the Kabbalah course. Then we have winter is going to be the missing piece, foundation behind Israel's central place in Jewish life. So this also, they said, we've given a few courses on Israel in the past. They mainly start with a war and they talk about Israeli, kind of how Israel works, and then it kind of digs into Israel origins and Jewish history in the Bible. This is going to go the opposite direction. It's going to start with why we even needed Israel. You know, why did God even come up with the idea of giving Jews to Israel? And then it's going to work its way down into modern day systems in Israel. And the third one is going to be spring. It's going to chew on this. It's all about like Jewish food, the traditions, the laws, the dietary laws, the traditions, and history. They're supposed to be really great courses. I usually, you know, when I get a new course, I usually read through it, and then I get like this aha moment of like what it's about, and then I'm able to successfully market it. You know, you got to know your people, the age group, and everything like that, and find a way to market it. So I haven't got any of these courses yet. They did mention that they got some big grants, so each course is being reimagined by like a different major marketing company. And we'll see which one wins, which one does the best. But I look forward to seeing you all. You know, if you're not on the email list of Chabad, you can come to me after and I'll put you on. We have the high holidays coming. First Friday is this week. A lot of different things happening. And God willing, we'll see you all around. Hope you enjoyed. We're going to offer a bundle this year for all three courses. But I'm still waiting for them to pump out information about, you know, they're redoing a lot of stuff. So I'm still waiting for them to pump out enough information to do that. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free, you know, you got my email. If you have any questions or comments,